Media Institute, the foremost independent advocate for the First Amendment for over 4 decades, is one of the nation's leading nonpartisan organizations focused on media and communications policy. The Media Institute promotes freedom of speech, recognizes excellence in journalism, and encourages a competitive media environment and communications industry. Considering the current state of affairs in the nation's capital and across the country, our mission is more relevant than ever. Thanks to our sponsors and supporters. At the platinum level, AT&T, Charter Communications, Consumer Technology Association, iHeartMedia, LG Electronics USA, Tegna, Verizon Communications, and Viacom CBS. Our gold sponsors include America's Public Television Stations, CTIA, Everything Wireless, Education Networks of America, Interactive Advertising Bureau, National Association of Broadcasters, Comcast NBC Universal, and NCTA, the Internet and Television Association. Silver sponsors include ACA Connects, America's Communications Association, the Advanced Television Systems Committee, ATSC, Cooley LLP, Corporation for Public Broadcasting, Covington and Burling LLP, Cox Enterprises Inc., Davis Wright Tremaine LLP, DLA Piper, Fox Corporation, Lorman Center PLLC, News Media Alliance, T-Mobile, U.S. Telecom, Wiley, and Wilkinson Barker Nauer LLP. Thanks to all for making today's event possible. And now the President and CEO of the Media Institute, Rick Kapler.
Hey, good afternoon, and welcome to our Communications Forum virtual luncheon for June. Thank you for joining us. And a special thank you to our luncheon sponsors who make these events possible. Today, we welcome back one of our most popular speakers. But before I introduce him, let me tell you about a couple of things coming up at the Institute. Next month, on Thursday, July 15th, our virtual luncheon speaker will be Jonathan Adelstein, President and CEO of the Wireless Infrastructure Association. With legislative proposals for infrastructure, including broadband, being in the news so much lately, I know Commissioner Adelstein will have a lot to say about how the goal of expanding our broadband infrastructure could best be achieved. So mark your calendar for Thursday, July 15th. Next Tuesday, June 29th, our Digital Media Center will release its first white paper. It's titled Calibrating Digital Media Trends for the Post-Pandemic New Normal. And it was written by our TMI Distinguished Fellow, Stuart Brotman. This is a fascinating look at how the pandemic has affected the use of various digital media and how those trends are likely to play out in the future. If you'd like a copy of this white paper after it's released, please contact me directly. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, who happens to be a longtime friend of the Media Institute. Gary Shapiro is President and CEO of the Consumer Technology Association, or CTA, North America's largest technology trade association. In fact, CTA is the tech sector. As I'm sure you know, CTA owns and produces CES, the most influential tech event in the world. As the head of CTA for more than 3 decades, Gary has effectively ushered the consumer technology industry through major periods of technological upheaval and transformation. Gary has had his finger on the pulse of the tech industry for the last 30 years. His role in building CES into the global stage for tech innovation uniquely equips him to identify both emerging trends and the policy environments essential for innovation. Gary has worked tirelessly to build bridges in the name of innovation and progress across industry, across the public-private divide, and across the aisle. In addition to being a superb advocate for the tech industry, I'd have to say that Gary is also a remarkable visionary and futurist. He's written 3 books, starting in 2011 with The Comeback: How Innovation Will Restore the American Dream. He followed that in 2013 with Ninja Innovation: The 10 Killer Strategies of the World's Most Successful Businesses. And most recently, in 2018, he authored Ninja Future: Secrets to Success in the New World of Innovation. Gary's insights have made him a New York Times best-selling author. As I mentioned earlier, Gary is a longtime friend of the Institute, something I'm very proud of. In fact, we're welcoming Gary back today for his fourth speaking appearance at a Communications Forum luncheon event. And I think that's still the record. Now, let me remind you that during Gary's presentation, you'll have a chance to ask questions using the Ask a Question feature on your screen. Just type your questions and send them in. We'll have a good Q&A session after Gary's presentation. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it is truly my honor and privilege to welcome our very distinguished guest, Mr. Gary Shapiro.
Thank you, Rick, for that kind introduction. And thank you, Chairman Dick Wiley, for inviting me. You are always in my career been so compelling in asking me to do things and ending up, I can't say no to you. And I want to thank the Media Institute for giving me this opportunity to formally present to you. At the Consumer Technology Association, we are passionate believers in the Institute's mission of protecting First Amendment values. That mission is more important today as our nation seems less interested in protecting free speech than at any time I can recall. You know, I grew up in New York as a Jewish boy, and I believed and still believe that the Nazis were really horrible people. But when Nazi sympathizers wanted to parade in Skokie, Illinois in the late 1970s, it also became our cultural gospel that we value and elevate freedom of speech, no matter how much we disagree with what is being said. While the courts have certainly helped define very limited exceptions, we always come back to the fundamental principle that we are built as a nation on a shared desire to freely express and receive divergent views. I've given a few prior speeches to the Media Institute, as you just heard. In one, I talked about how First Amendment principles not only focus on the right of Americans to speak, but also includes the right for others to receive their views. Since our nation's founding, the fact is that many innovative technologies such as radio, telephone, television, computers, and the internet have enhanced our ability to create, share, and receive new ideas. Indeed, they have also fueled our country's global economic success. And in many of these areas, the US has led the world. I can't help but compare us to China and North Korea, whose citizens are literally blocked off from receiving external information or views. In one speech before the Media Institute, I discussed the intersection between intellectual property and the First Amendment. The Media Institute is so unique because it gathers content and technology interests together. And it's so fascinating how we balance the two sometimes conflicting constitutional rights of IP and the First Amendment. Today, I wonder, however, if our nation is devaluing First Amendment principles. Can most Americans recognize, remember, and even reunite around our First Amendment principles? These are the values that define who we are as a nation. And I think we're at an inflection point right now in our nearly 250-year experiment in democracy. We are under attack with a civil war where both sides choose their facts and how they perceive our nation. Political tribal leaders seem increasingly to view the First Amendment as a barrier to their parochial goals, rather than a common cultural template we share in helping ensure our success. Think about who we are. We are a nation in which almost all our people came from somewhere else. We have a very, very brief history without the homogeneity or the thousands of years of history which helped most other countries resolve their toughest social issues. Rather, our strength is our diversity. It fuels our ideas, our can-do attitude, our innovation, our creativity, and our success. We are a great nation, but we as people share more than common geography. We share a focus on the future, a belief in a better life for our children, and an appreciation for the brilliance of our founders. The founders bequeathed us the unique liberty embodied in the Bill of Rights. The First Amendment of the Bill of Rights encases our essence, the core of who we are and what we stand for. Of course, it's about freedom of the press, but it's also the freedom to associate with like-minded people. It is the right to petition our government. It also protects our freedom of religion. Again, compare us to China, where in reality, none of these rights exist. Yet China is a giant, using its growing strength not only to dominate economically, but to spread its differing value system. And while China is increasing its influence, it's also increasing repression of views that are not the party line. Its journalists are government employees and cannot criticize the government. The Chinese screws are tightening on the freedom-loving citizens of Hong Kong and Taiwan. And at the same time, China is focusing laser like on new technologies that are so important, including artificial intelligence. China produces millions of scientists, IT specialists, and engineers each year. And they also can create in China huge data sets to propel artificial intelligence. Why? Because there is little respect for privacy that we value in China. Nearly every Chinese citizen is actually socially ranked today based on their social media comments, their credit history, and even cameras catching them doing things like jaywalking. These rankings determine their ability to travel, to stay in hotels, even their placement on dating websites. I bring this up to raise the alarm. We are different than China. We have different values. Those values are embedded in our First Amendment, yet we too are deviating from our path of righteousness into some very dangerous areas. Consider what we're doing. We're shutting down the diversity of opinions on college campuses and even in the media. Cancel culture has extended to teachers with different views. Conservative speakers invited to speak on campuses and then blocked from speaking. And even editors from respected publications like the New York Times who dare to have a view different from woke culture. Even the New York Times recently said, in talking about the ACLU, the free speech stalwart, that the ACLU is now wavering in its First Amendment advocacy. Both major political parties in the United States are pushing proposals clearly in conflict with the letter and the spirit of the First Amendment. Florida's Republican governor recently signed a law which tells social media platforms what content and speakers they must allow. And recently, a Democratic senator tried to use her position in Congress to intimidate, threaten, and punish a company for what she describes as, quote, snotty tweets. And both parties play games with online free expression, trying to browbeat internet platforms into leaving up speech that helps their side, but removes speech that's favored by their opponents. Members of both political parties want to make internet platforms responsible for user-generated comments and reviews. This is like making hotel owners responsible for guest behavior. Creating this liability, given the huge amount of postings, would severely crimp the value of these services and lead to an onslaught of opportunistic trial lawyer lawsuits. Think about it. If Yelp is responsible for user reviews, if Nextdoor is responsible for a neighbor's critical comments, or if Facebook is responsible for political comments, not only are we making these services essentially unusable, we are trampling on the free expression values that we treasure, that are embodied in our Constitution. I know that the First Amendment talks about Congress and government, but if legislators threaten retaliatory action, if they act to remove a longstanding protection for user-generated comments, or if they even respond to competitor complaints and seek to shut down or shrink or limit the size of or limit acquisitions by or otherwise seek to hurt social media platforms, are we eroding the freedom of speech that made us the envy of the world? The shining city on the hill that President Reagan talked about and which so many in the world admire and aspire to reach? In addition to free speech, another value that makes America special is that we celebrate and encourage success. We believe that providing popular services, serving customers, and making a profit is a glorious thing. That is why the House antitrust package, set to be marked up tomorrow, is an existential threat to our competitiveness. The bills would effectively prohibit acquisitions by our largest companies, leaving startups and their investors who counted on selling their companies, leave them out in the cold. It would prohibit beloved services like Amazon Prime, Maps and Google services, and pre-installed apps on your iPhone. It would require companies to open their systems to competitors and potential wrongdoers. None of it promotes consumer welfare. In fact, it will frustrate the consumers and citizens and constituents of the members of Congress supporting it. And by imposing these mandates only on our most successful companies, it sends a terrible message to all the entrepreneurs. You better not grow too big or become too successful, or you too will be faced with onerous and crushing mandates and new theories of liability. These bills are being rushed through without a hearing, without testimony. Why? Because it's politically expedient. Even the bill sponsors do not agree on what the bills require or what companies they would impact. The fact is that these same targeted companies and the tech industry rescued us during the pandemic. They saved our economy, our jobs, our health, our kids, and our sanity. And because of technology like artificial intelligence-driven rapid gene sequencing, we did a miracle. We produced a vaccine to a deadly virus in less than a year. Never before done. Technology is also changing our lives in so many ways for the better. Digital health and remote care keep us healthy at home. Remote learning allows our children to learn despite closed classrooms. It's creating an unprecedented growth in America's retirement stock portfolios and pension fund, and it's keeping inflation in check, as it is the major driver of productivity improvement, and it has created or directly supported at least 18 million American jobs. But technology is also disrupting older industries, and let's be frank, some of those disrupted industries are gleefully stirring the anti-tech fervor in Washington because tech has disrupted almost every industry. And the disruption is not slowing down. Think how almost 100 years ago, when my organization started as the Radio Manufacturers Association, what tech did. It affected live performances by bands and by piano players during silent movies. Now, I began my career in Washington as a young lawyer representing the predecessor organization to the CTA, as Hollywood sought to ban the VCR. And the music industry jumped on and tried to block all audio recording of music by putting, believe it or not, an audible notch in music. Fortunately, they did not succeed with legislation. In fact, many disruptions continue to occur. Cable disrupted broadcasting, satellite disrupted cable. The internet and streaming continue to disrupt many business models, and the cycle won't stop as innovators like Clubhouse, Substack, Dispo, and TikTok gain millions of followers and challenge established social media platforms. In fact, Clubhouse became a unicorn, $1 billion in valuation earlier this year, only 9 months after its launch. Now that's a dynamic marketplace. While all this disruption may hurt individual companies and their employees and shareholders, it is the necessary part of what makes our economic system superior to any other. Creative disruption allows consumers to benefit from better, less expensive, more robust services. It's the reason why the US continues to be the world's hotbed of innovation. The free market system works, except when government goes beyond legitimate regulatory guardrails and rushes to regulate in a harmful way, restricting innovation and often simultaneously chilling speech. Thus, we see weird and dangerous new antitrust theories protecting competitors, not competition, and not consumers. And that is a malady that's just unique to Washington, because while some politicians relish the idea of straitjacketing tech companies, average Americans love what the tech companies can and will do. Despite the nonstop efforts by DC politicians to demonize tech, Americans remain relentless tech optimists. Morning Consult produced Most Loved Brands of 2020 report, and the top companies included Google, Amazon, and Netflix. The report includes rankings of the brand's favorability, trust, and community impact. The fact is, large tech companies have provided innovations like vaccines, electric vehicles, bringing down the cost of batteries to store green energy, vegetarian meat options, and other ways that have improved our quality of life. And each of you know that tech enables free speech. Indeed, the First Amendment enables tech innovation. It restricts government from quiet backroom deals with threatened incumbent industries. In almost every tech battle in my career, from ensuring the legality of the VCR, to protecting video rentals, to protecting the internet from those alleging it was an illegal copying device, to fighting for market disruptors like Airbnb, Uber, and Lyft, we won as average Americans and consumers realize the benefits, along soon with politicians, that these are services which provide incredible benefits and choices, and they allow not only enhanced life, but they create new choices, new opportunities, they produce new jobs, and they elevated the US and citizens everywhere. Because of these and other innovations, in some ways, think about it, we live in the golden age of free speech. 20 years ago, to speak to an audience of millions, what did you need? You need to be invited by an owner of a TV network, a radio, or a newspaper. Today, you need a smartphone and a data connection. That's it. Anyone can create content, and so many do. As of last year, some 37 million YouTube channels existed, giving musicians, film producers, and artists a venue to display their creativity. Indeed, free speech and the First Amendment remain important to Americans. According to a Harvard-Harris poll released just today, the strong majority of Americans, over 4 out of 5, 81%, believe it is important that elementary school students be taught about the First Amendment and the importance of free speech. Yet, do we see it being taught? Do we be seeing it being played out? In fact, the New Washington Sport is lambasting and threatening the free speech of tech platforms. But these platforms, let's be real, they face an impossible task. They are asked to determine truthfulness of political speech. You ever tried doing that in an election cycle? And they have to determine what's offensive in dozens of countries in different languages. And critics, what do? They take out of context quotes and barely relevant facts. And Facebook is somehow expected to be a super State Department and Supreme Court, analyzing and adjudicating local and regional political claims. The reality is that content moderation at scale is incredibly daunting. Platforms will inevitably make mistakes. Facebook users post 350 million photos a day. Twitter users post 200 billion, that's billion with a B, tweets per year. Moderation decisions upset people, but they anger both sides of the political spectrum. That means they must be doing something right. We agree that platforms have a moral and a legal obligation to prevent users from inciting violence. That said, every American should be uncomfortable when a former president of the United States is barred from major social media platforms. Not only is this an extreme example of chilling political speech, but it is disenfranchising not just one person, but millions of his followers. What could be more harmful and divisive for a country than to shut out a passionate minority? Is the ban necessary to promote public safety? Or does it merely inflame and exacerbate our existing political divisions? This should concern anyone who cares about free expression. While we can disagree with platform content moderation decisions, but the last thing we want to do is replace an imperfect content moderation system with actual government censorship, taking companies and speech off the internet. We have also seen how our own government chills speech during the pandemic. As health officials first said to avoid masks and then mandated them, as allegations in the Wuhan lab causing the disease were totally quashed and shut off the internet, as schools shut down nationwide with little scientific basis and discounting the collateral damage, and as scientific facts on COVID victims having virus antibodies that worked were ignored. And even COVID victims were told to get 2-dose vaccines. A group of press who passively accepted and platforms choked off any dissenting voices despite the scientific basis for the claims. I might add that my wife, a surgeon who's written extensively about COVID, advocated for only one vaccine after having COVID. Our comments that she put and I put on social media were removed. This was upsetting to me. She was told she was wrong and must have the second dose. But eventually, science came around, and even Dr. Fauci agreed that the second dose is not necessary for those who have recovered from COVID. How do you challenge existing scientific fact if you can't even allow your voice to be heard, if we don't have the First Amendment values to our culture? Now, to be fair, platforms were faced with a rapidly changing environment and scientific consensus during a crisis. While they did not make every call correctly, it's plausible that the pressures on internet platforms mirrored the stresses and divisions of our society as we responded to this terrible pandemic. But I must note there's some brightness here. Recently, the top CDC official testified in a Senate hearing last month that outdoor COVID-19 transmission was a threat causing some 10% of COVID-19 cases. Kudos to the New York Times for digging into this factual misstatement, noting that only one study even suggested this, and that one study actually included people working indoors as well as outdoors. Thankfully, the First Amendment allows us still to question our government, even in a pandemic. Between the pandemic and tribal politics, though, the First Amendment has had a rough 2020 and 2021. But given legitimate concerns that new media needs some guardrails, the issue we must grapple with is what should government do regarding internet speech? I submit and hope you agree that we first must follow the Hippocratic Oath of medicine and do no harm. We should avoid mandates conflicting with America's free speech transitions. Second, we also should be practical and sensitive to business realities and avoid mandates that advantage large companies but impose burdens on small companies or startups. Big companies have big pockets and can afford big law firms and big compliance departments. But we have to protect the startups, the innovators and creators in America. Third, we must avoid doing anything that would undercut US global competitiveness or do the unintentional bidding of China or other economic or military rivals. Last week, our often divided Senate overwhelmingly passed a bill helping the US compete with China. But congressional attacks on our technology innovators and other successful businesses only help the Chinese agenda of catching and surpassing the United States. President Xi must be gleeful when he hears American leaders push to undermine our own First Amendment or talk of breaking up our crown jewel tech companies. Fourth, we must not do the bidding of lawsuit-happy trial lawyers or legacy industries that want to use government to undercut their digital competitors. Our nation already suffers competitively from a litigation tax imposed by the trial lawyer lobby, and that hurts already our national competitiveness. Consistent with this, we can and should provide clear and reasonable guardrails that give American companies legal certainty. They shouldn't have to ask the government for permission to create and try new things, but they must be willing to correct, accept, and avoid infringing on IP and defaming and slandering others. This means having a process in place to correct or remove postings once platforms learn of legitimate and clear challenges. We should encourage US internet platforms to be more transparent about their content moderation decisions and give people more control over what they see in their feeds. Facebook's Oversight Board and Twitter's Birdwatch are evolving examples of the type of transparent and fair processes which can address legitimate concerns. And for the sake of First Amendment principles, we must avoid imposing new liabilities on a company for those using its platforms, as that will only chill legal speech. The bottom line is that technology or innovation is a tool. It's not good or bad. Think of how humans took advantage of fire, created a hammer, invented the wheel, harnessed electricity, and split the atom. These innovations and others created problems, but once our founders grappled with them and created appropriate legal frameworks, they vastly improved and lengthened our lives or provided other tangible benefits. Our nation is so blessed with good fortune as we are a land of plenty and a nation of innovators. That is who we are as Americans. We have to figure out how to unite around our values, especially the First Amendment. We must ensure our identity as one free nation centered on liberty and First Amendment principles that will allow us to both innovate and respect the diversity of viewpoints defining our nation. We are a free people. That means free markets with minimal mandates. It means free speech with diversity and ideas, both giving and receiving. And it means attracting the best and brightest and welcoming innovators and entrepreneurs. Innovation is clearly changing the world. We are advancing quickly in healthcare, education, AI, robotics, and self-driving, as well as content creation, delivery, and predictive intelligence. But we have to move from these less productive debates on shutting off speech to more productive discussions. How can we balance our important liberties and culture and First Amendment rights with the rapid evolution of platforms, innovation, and technology changing and improving life around the world? I want to thank you for listening, thank the Media Institute and its sponsors for inviting me to speak on one of the most pressing issues facing our nation. I so much appreciate what the Media Institute does. It's so important, and I look forward to answering any of your questions.
Gary, thank you so much. I appreciate your kind words about the Media Institute, and certainly we are very impressed and grateful for everything that CTA does to further the First Amendment. You're not just a trade association pushing member interest, but you have the big picture in mind, searching for those ways to keep this fundamental freedom intact and strong at the basis for everything that goes on in this country. And we certainly appreciate everything you and CTA have done and continue to do to further the First Amendment. And I have to say that I think you've surpassed, met and exceeded your previous presentations to Media Institute audiences here with today's presentation. That was fantastic. And you touched on so many good points, and we're so glad to have you here and to share your viewpoints. We have a few questions. I'd like to start with one question of my own, or just kind of a subject area here. We see the First Amendment being used maybe in some slightly different ways, or kind of manipulated, as you alluded to, in some different ways today. Yet, we still have this sort of fundamental tension between the free speech right of a media outlet, whatever that is these days, to exercise their own editorial judgment. And that was a upheld by the courts back in the 70s in terms of newspapers and has continued to this day. And yet, so on one hand, we have that free speech right of media providers, and yet we also have the free speech right of users. And maybe it's a little different situation when you have, talking about publishing letters to the editor versus Facebook or Twitter or something like that. So now you have the First Amendment kind of being invoked on both sides of that tension. And how do you grapple with that?
You're absolutely right. There is a tension and there's a balance. And the courts have been very clear on what the First Amendment law is. But part of my discussion and presentation here was about what we should be comfortable with as Americans. And if some of the actions that these social media companies are taking because they're being pressured by government, that is crossing a line in my view. And certainly the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times have a right to different views, just the way as the platforms have a right to different views. But when they start, there are lines that are crossed. Government can cross the line, but also I think it is crossing a line when a former president, for example, is shut off, and then even a competitive service can't get a server in the United States to present on. I was no Trump supporter, to be honest, but that made me very personally uncomfortable because I just don't understand how shutting off people from a very important media is something which helps unite our country and is in the interest of our country.
Good. Gary, we have some great questions from our viewers here. We'll start with the first question here. How do deep fakes impact free speech?
Well, that's a great question. It's come out recently how strong Speaker Pelosi was when there was that deep fake of hers and how upset she was with the social media platforms that they didn't immediately pull it down. And I can understand why anyone would be upset with that. And I think there is an obligation by platforms, once they are aware with strong evidence that there's a deep fake, to take it down or label it such. Otherwise, it's the same thing as a newspaper running something that they know is false. So I think the analogies there to the print world carry forward there.
How should Section 230 be reformed to ensure free speech continues while also legally protecting the platform from third-party content?
Well, that's a great question, and as I referred to, there's things we could do with 230. There needs to be some guardrails and people understand, but in terms of reform implies that there's something wrong with it. The 230 liability protection was what allowed our internet to grow and be the envy of the world, frankly. But you can't help but read some of the comments on there and be disturbed as an American, no matter what side you're on, because it shows the ugly side sometimes of what people think as Americans, but that's part of the First Amendment itself, is you're exposed to views you may not like. And the moderation decisions that are being made can be confusing or frustrating. But I think what my side of the industry could do, the content, those that have these platforms, they need more transparency. They need public discussion. I think the oversight boards are very helpful, but I think it's evolutionary. This is not all or nothing. And we just have to keep getting better on that. But the truth is, I know that there's liberals think the conservatives are favored, conservatives think the liberals are favored. All the research seems to show that it's pretty much balanced in terms of what's out there, in terms of what's trending on Twitter or what's being influenced on Facebook. It's in fact there's a lot of evidence that the conservatives are actually doing quite well on social media. So the liberal allegations in that I'm not personally that sympathetic with. I should say the conservative allegations I'm not that quite sympathetic with, because the conservatives are among the most popular social media things that are trending on Twitter, et cetera.
Is there any one bill in that House package that you're more concerned about than others?
Well, I'm concerned with all of them, frankly, because there's a lack of process, which I just don't understand. And there's just new antitrust theories being thrown out there. I started out as an antitrust attorney a long time ago, and it was the consumer welfare standard, which has served us for years. And the fact that we could come along and either by some aggressive attorneys in the FTC or Justice Department or through Congress radically change that without even considering the ramification, because competitors always try to use the antitrust laws to beat back their own competition. That's not healthy in my view. The only thing that matters are consumers benefiting or not. And that's the standard has served us well for 100 years and should continue. I will add, though, that as knowing how important entrepreneurs are in the food chain, I am very concerned about thing barring companies from acquisitions. If you bar big companies from acquiring small companies, you will dry up immediately a good portion of venture capital around the United States, because venture capitalists want an exit. And the way you get an exit is you either go public, you sell to a big company, or you just keep growing. And while 2 out of 3, you might say you're losing 1 out of 3, exits are really important to get investment. And if we choke up our seed corn, if we hurt entrepreneurs, we're hurting our country.
Here's a question from Gary Arlen. The new services you describe, especially digital healthcare and electronic records, create new realms of cross-industry regulation. And how will multiple agencies, FDA, CDC, FCC, et cetera, collaborate to assure privacy and security?
Well, that's a great question, because there's 2 big issues there: privacy and security, or cybersecurity, if you will. And what we would like to see more than anything else is a federal privacy law. So startups can occur, startups can basically go nationally overnight, which is very important. So there's not that huge barrier to entry, and only big companies can keep their places. So that's number 1, is a federal privacy law. And I have full confidence in the Federal Trade Commission, even with the new recent nominated and elected chairman, is one that's very capable of doing that. That's traditional Federal Trade Commission authority. In terms of cybersecurity, we've been working as an organization with other organizations, government bodies, National Institute of Standards and Technology, and others, to develop voluntary standards. So there's a certain amount of consistency so consumers are protected in the cybersecurity realm. But cybersecurity is difficult because it's just not business and it's just not government. Frankly, Americans need to be educated that, you don't click on what you don't know, you don't open it. I think everyone has to be on board for this one. And it's something that's very important. We did express some concern about the FCC taking authority that Congress never gave it, allowing them to bar products retroactively and things like that. And in the last week or so, we expressed our concern in the FCC going forward in that. And of course, this is a discussion which has to go on. What we're concerned about is chilling innovation and going backwards in laws rather than forward. And I think we always have to move forward and come up with a way. And it's a partnership. When I see Dick Wiley, as we were talking earlier, I think of the proudest accomplishment I have in my industry is how we did the HDTV standard in the United States. That was government and industry working together for a national goal. And a lot of things, I think, if we approach that, we know what the goal is, we know where we want to get. I think industry and government can do great things together.
Hey, going back for a minute, you talked a bit about things at the FTC and the change in antitrust sentiment. What do you make of the court cases that have been ongoing for a while now against Facebook and Google under current antitrust laws?
What I make of it, well, I have hundreds, well over 1,000, almost 2,000 members. They're all members of ours. And when our members fight, I'm perfectly happy not to get engaged, because that's one company against another company. And I stick with my own guardrails as well. And that's outside my guardrails. I do think there's a little too much litigation in the country. I thought I made that pretty clear. I think we could, that's not a competitive advantage of the United States.
Okay. How do algorithms that inflate the views of certain ideas and speakers affect the marketplace of ideas?
That's very interesting. I mean, algorithms are like any tool. They're neutral. I mean, and trying to get transparency of an algorithm is a challenge. I'm more concerned of algorithms that focus on things that are important when they are important, like race, in determining who gets let out of jail or something like that. But in terms of what most artificial intelligence is and algorithms are used for, is like things that make a difference where there's no real risk there. Well, there's risk, but how you run a factory, how you fly a plane today, how you determine what can cure a disease. This is artificial intelligence. It's using algorithms. It's using historic data. It's using where privacy isn't an issue, race isn't an issue. None of these are issues. But if you're talking about something which inflates certain ideas, these are things we have to deal with. There's a lot of fake Twitter accounts out there, and eventually the press does their job. They expose them. People cut back. These are evolving things where we could have dialogues on that are, I think we share national goals on these things. We want to make sure that we understand what's out there, that there's some basic understanding. It's like the debate going on in the securities field right now about the fact that you may pay nothing for trades, but your broker is selling your information so they know exactly how you're going to buy and sell before they buy and sell your stock. These are debates which we have to occur. And I am big on sunlight being a disinfectant, transparency, and guidelines, ethical or if necessary, legal. We as an industry do not oppose government action. In fact, we think it can help in many ways, so we know what the rules are, but we don't want to have to go to the government to ask permission to do something new, because that will choke innovation.
Along these lines, there was a bill introduced just recently, in fact, reintroduced from 2019, called the Filter Bubble Transparency Act, which makes an attempt to bring some transparency to this whole business about algorithms, letting people know or giving them access to the algorithm framework that is affecting their flow of information, and giving them opportunities to opt out of that or to get a neutral flow of information. How do you react to that bill and that concept?
Well, I think there's a difference between disclosure and mandates. So if there's a requirement that you must reveal certain aspects of what your algorithm is doing that the public should know, that can make sense. But if you have to reveal everything about an algorithm, and which is sometimes very difficult to figure out. For example, algorithms are figuring out now and saving lives in self-driving vehicles. And a lot of cars have either passive collision avoidance, they have active collision avoidance, and soon they'll be driverless. Now, what goes into those algorithms is incredible. There's so much there. If you have to disclose it all, it would be bigger than the things you click on in the internet now that you're agreeing to waive your rights just because you want to get to a website. They have to distinguish between a dog and a rock, a ball and a kid, what you're doing, what a sign looks like versus a deer. It is so complex and so difficult, and there's so many factors that sometimes disclosures would be pretty meaningless because they'd be so lengthy.
Yeah, but switching gears here a bit, this is about climate change. Is CTA still supporting a resilience agenda when it comes to climate change?
Well, we certainly supported several years ago. We took a position that we as an industry will meet or exceed the Paris Accords. I think they're very, very modest, frankly, as does our industry. We want to go beyond them. We're reporting each year on what our industry is doing on a regular basis. It's very important to us. But in terms of resilience, I think resilience is a concept we were pushing pretty intensely because there is a trade-off between resilience and dependence. And I think our country grew when it was founded on the concept of resilience. And my personal view is we're getting away from it really quickly. And I think that's a cultural value that I do not share. I would rather see our kids become more resilient, that workers focus on getting jobs rather than government checks, which is, we took a real sharp turn because of the pandemic. And now there's a huge worker shortage in the United States that I think is very dangerous. We're heading towards a guaranteed income society, which doesn't really, I believe work is something that people need for their own self-worth. And I believe that's what makes American great, is that we are resilient. And I think back in those Chilean kids that were stuck in the mine, the little soccer kids, and they were there for a week in the dark and they survived. And I ask myself, can American kids do that? And when we think about things, we have to build in resiliency. And some of that is building in localism. And I don't mean the broadcaster-like localism, which could apply, but I mean getting things locally. We've realized that, for example, through this pandemic and still suffering and will for a long time, the fact that we are relying upon a supply chain which is global. And I think President Trump and now President Biden have taken steps now to move away from a heavy reliance on China, which is dangerous for a lot of reasons. And now we're trying to become more self-resilient, and I definitely would support that. From an environmental perspective, I don't see exactly the trade-off and the connection, but we do believe in making a greener world, and we think we're doing that with our products and our changes in practices. But we also are very focused on the importance of resilience, not only in the supply chain, but in the cultural values there as well.
Mm-hmm. One more macro question. Is our growing national debt a threat to our freedom, including our free speech protections?
God bless the person who asked it. Absolutely. I can't think of a bigger fundamental threat to the United States than our growing national debt. It is something that we as an organization have taken a very strong position on. We have never asked the government or supported the government giving money to our industry, even for things which might be good, like the R&D tax credit. We haven't taken a position on it, or the HDTV converter boxes that were subsidized for our consumers. We did not support those proposals or legislation because we think the fundamental threat, as we've tripled from $10 billion at the beginning of the Obama administration, expanded it through Trump, and now we're expanding it through Biden. We're about to hit $30 trillion in debt. $30 trillion on a 5% normalized interest rate, which we're heading to very quickly with inflation and higher interest rates. 5% of $30 trillion is $1.5 trillion. That will suck up every domestic program, including defense spending, and leave payment on the interest for the debt and entitlements barely. So we are heading on a collision course. We are stealing from our children. It's intergenerational theft. It is immoral and it is wrong. And I can't think of anything that distresses me more.
Boy. Well, Gary, we have time for one more question. So let me bring it a little closer to home here. What are the prospects for a successful in-person CES in Las Vegas early in 2022? And what issues you're dealing with to hold a big gathering post-pandemic?
So great question. CES 2022 looks fantastic. I was going over some of the floor plans this morning. We have an incredible number of global brands and exhibitors. There's a lot of new technology there. There'll be a huge focus on self-driving and artificial intelligence, AI and robotics, as well as a big health push, record participation by auto companies and others. It will be a show which will be very exciting. We have keynoters that we'll be announcing shortly. But we're realistic. You know, there are pandemic issues we're dealing with, especially outside the United States. We definitely think there'll be fewer international people coming, although many are coming in some of our international delegations. We actually have a record number from different places that are signing up. You know, we're in a great trajectory as a nation where hopefully the rest of the world will follow us and get there. But people, even the most cynical journalists who complain about going to Las Vegas in 2021, we're telling all of them, we're saying how much we miss going to Vegas. I think, you know, NAB will have a great show, we hope. But there's nothing, as much as I'm a cheerleader for the technology and our ability to have discussions like this using amazing technology, there's nothing like the 5 cents face-to-face live interactive experience where you could use all your senses, not only to judge what a company is about, but what a person is about. And also the value of serendipity, which we can't, and others have tried, and we weren't successful in creating the serendipity, the joyful discovery of knowing or learning something that you don't know, forming a connection, a new paradigm. Because what's going on in the tech world and in innovation generally is that basically the companies that are succeeding globally are the ones that have intersecting alliances across their vertical category. And that's what the CES is positioned for. It's to get the CTOs, the CEOs, the CXOs who are responsible for the growth of the company, seeing the potential of what's out there and forging the partnerships that allow innovation to occur, the companies to grow. And there's a lot of cross-licensing, cross-intelligence. And that's why teamwork, being together, has become such an important trait. That's why MBAs are valuable. They really matter in the ability to work cross cultures and to work globally. So I look forward and invite the Media Institute audience to be with us in Las Vegas at CES. And I'm sure one of the big issues we'll be talking about there is the First Amendment and some of the issues we talked about today.
Well, Gary, we look forward to being back in Las Vegas with you at CES. It's going to be terrific to be back in person and to get the benefit of all of those characteristics of being just live and in person that you talked about. And we wish you a very successful show. So thank you for your presentation today. This was truly outstanding. And thank you for sharing your passion for innovation, your passion for the First Amendment, and your passion and love for this country and the future of this country. Thank you for sharing that with us today, Gary.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity. I appreciate it.
Well, it's been very uplifting, and we're very grateful to you for sharing your time and your very thoughts that and lift us all up and just make us glad to be Americans and glad to be a part of this technological revolution. So we thank you for that, and we appreciate your being here, and can't wait to have you back again. So for number 5, right? So I want to thank you, Gary, and thanks to all of our sponsors for being with us today. Special thanks to Dave Arland of Arland Communications, John Taylor of LG Electronics, and our chairman of the board, Mr. Dick Wiley. And we look forward to seeing you back here on July 15th with our speaker, Jonathan Adelstein of the Wireless Infrastructure Association. And thank you all for being with us today. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you to our guest speaker today, and a big thank you again to our sponsors. We'll see you next month.